With Wuthering Waves 2.4 finally out in its complete glory. God damn, look at that limelight. It's time we look back, recap, and untangle the overlap mysteries of Septimont. All of it. And if you watched my theories video on 2.4, then welcome back. You'll come to learn that whilst, as expected, I got the fair majority of stuff wrong, there's actually some things your boy managed to get right. But today's video isn't about goading over my big brain plays, it's about laying out everything in 2.4 in my oh so funky ways. And yes, I went to some effort to make that line rhyme. Pitiful. Ugh. But of course, if I made any points that were undeniably false, or missed any unanswered questions in the patch, please let me know. Because come on, you think I'm perfect? You think this is a face of perfection? Alright, that's enough stalling for viewer attention. Let's finally start connecting the dots on the riddles that make up Wuthering Waves 2.4. And to start us off, let's review the whole chronology of 2.4, exploring every event that led up to and ended our first patch in Septimont. But since a lot of content creators have already done that, I'll do it, but incorrectly? Long ago, Mia's family probably thought, "Fuck Raguna, Imperator looks like an Uma Musume gone wrong," and sailed over to Septimont to start a new life. Some years later, Mia, a grown-up girl, probably said, "Mum, Dad, fuck traditional female expectations, I'ma be a gladiator," and she's loving the sport. Life's good. That is until Leviathan eyes her up and thinks to itself,
"Oh, I'm about to up in Septimont via you."
Because it turns out, Mia was also a potential vessel for the Thenodian to resonate with before Cartethyia. But as we'll learn, she wasn't blessed at all. So, as Leviathan incessantly whispers to Mia, her mental state turns for the worst. From hysteria to hallucinations, Mia becomes a walking list of mental illnesses. Whilst she sounds like an absolute cash grab for psychiatrists, unfortunately it is a Septimontian named John that picks her up in order to become her manager. Because while she's mentally in the drain, her combat prowess is still top tier. And no, she was not gifted with an OP resonance ability. In fact, it was dog water. No, her strength comes from being a woman of focus, commitment, and sheer will. That being said, John saw Mia as easy money, and the Septimont nobles saw Mia as an exploitable bunny. She's getting shafted spiritually and mentally. Give the girl a break, please. Fast forward some years and we arrive at the Great Aegon. Although back then they called it the Bloody Aegon because the matches were an all-out battle royale, except without the emotes. Still, it was a clusterfuck of warriors, echoes, and death. Hence the tournament name, Bloody Aegon. During day one of the Great Aegon, Mia's seen at a very low point, kinda like when people lose their 50-50. Being gaslit for most of your life would do that to anyone. During day two of the Great Aegon, however, things are a lot brighter. She not only wins the semi-final, but is also approached by a young fan who gifts her with a bouquet of viburnum flowers. Beautiful. But you know what wasn't beautiful? Day 3 of the Great Aegon. Why? But on a real, with Mia's grip on her sanity inches away from slipping, she did the only thing she could do in that moment to stop the Thenodian. And so, on the cliffs of the Vale of Glory, Mia saw her last sunlight before ultimately ending it all. What did Leviathan want in the Vale of Glory? I mean, yeah, winners of the Great Aegon come there in order to touch the weapons as a rite of great importance, but clearly the Thenodian doesn't give a fuck about tournament formalities because it skipped out on getting the championship award. So why did it come there? Well, it wanted to access the hub. No, I'm kidding. It's the central hub that it wanted. By corrupting it, Leviathan could then start its vicious pool party in the form of the Dark Tide, destroying Septimont in the process. But to even get to the central hub, Leviathan has to pass its two-factor authentication system, which needs Arsenosis' blessing and the Sentinel's frequency. Mia had the blessing since she's champ, and Leviathan had the frequency thanks to having assimilated with Imperator prior. Oh, it was so close. But alas, Mia took being a failed Thenodian resonator to heart. Literally. Because, you know, that's where she stabbed herself. And thus failed Leviathan's plans. What's funny is that Leviathan did have a plan B for Mia in case she didn't win the Great Aegon. Just use her to suck up to the city's nobles. But alas, with her death, Leviathan's plans completely failed, and that was the end of that. Or so we thought. Because 20 years later, Julia Silva fishes out a beautiful 5'8" Mia corpse for our KFC Code Fraxis member, Cristoforo. She also helps Cristoforo maintain the secrecy of his new experimental unit being built within Griffin Fortress, a structure thought to be impregnable.
I'll impregnate the bitch.
Anyway, as much of a cougar hunter as Cristoforo could be, no, Julia's services were not for free. For Cristoforo in return, aided Julia in carrying out her political schemes. So then, what did Cristoforo want to do with Mia's corpse? Science projects, to try and reawaken the slivers of Leviathan's frequency within her. The thing he built was called an incubator for a reason, you know. We're trying to raise a baby here and Cristoforo is the daddy. Sometime later, after Rover frees Cartethyia from the inverted tower, Leviathan finally awakens. Perhaps in defeating Fleur-de-Lis and thus the Thenodian losing its vessel, it had no choice but to run its tail back into Mia. Or maybe Cristoforo's experiments enhanced the frequency's ambience enough for Leviathan to return to it. Who knows? But it's back now, and Cristoforo seeks to get chummy with it. He intends to fulfill its lifelong dream of throwing its vicious pool party in Septimont. Additionally, he'll power it up some more too. And in return, well, that's left in the dark. but I'm theorizing that there'll be a continued cooperation between the two parties. The Fraxis having a Thenodian on its side? Nuts. Funnily enough though, during Cristoforo's Yap Fest, Rover's there just like, f off. But anyway, how will Cristoforo carry out Leviathan's will? Well, gather around kids, it's time for a story. Literally. He makes a story for Leviathan to swim around in. But first, he's gotta make it. For starters, every story needs a narrative. So what's the narrative? Inspired from the real-life event of contender Mya's experiences in the Great Aegon 20 years ago, the tragic fetishist Cristoforo presents his new piece, a gladiatorial epic featuring a lead that triumphs over Septimon's 3-day Great Aegon. Next, to realize his story, he'll need his lead, his main protagonist. There's no Ryan Gosling in Woo-Wah, so Cristoforo phones a friend to find one. And after a few business days, Julia delivers the sacrificial lamb, Septimon's rising star, Lupa. Something else is also rising. Yeah! Being a strong contender to win the upcoming Great Aegon, she is the perfect protagonist for Cristoforo's story. But the significance of this, I'll explain later. Okay, he's got the plot and he's got the cast. Sometimes both. It's time for the benevolent Cristoforo to make wishes come true. The methodology? Well, in manifesting his story as a Sonoro sphere, he overlays it on Septimont. Thus, the real Septimont has now become his stage to realize his story. And it's also become the temporary fishbowl for Leviathan. In the story, Gladiator Lupa wins through the Great Aegon matches for the first 2 days, before eventually claiming the championship on the 3rd day. And then this story just loops continuously. But how is any of this helping Leviathan? Well, in Cristoforo performing the boogie woogie technique, gosh, I'm such a weeb, he's actually able to swap the roles of Leviathan Mya and Lupa. As a result, during Lupa's days in the Sonoro sphere, she'll occasionally glitch into Leviathan Mya. The details of all this swapping stuff I will also go into later. Anyhow, when the glitch happens, Lupa basically blacks out for a bit, and when the wolf's away, it's time for the serpent to play. Its favorite game? Sticking it to the central hub harder than Rover stuck it to Fleur de Lis. On the story's 3rd day, of course, because it's this day that Lupa's champion, and she's on her way to the Veil of Glory as per usual Great Aegon winner formalities. This is the main reason the swap happens. In the past, Mya EOS'd herself before Leviathan could access the central hub, but in this Sonoro sphere, Leviathan Mya is able to swap places with Lupa, and thus, in basically becoming Lupa, it technically owns Arsenos' blessing again, since Lupa won the Great Aegon. Yes, Mya did win in the past too, but I suspect her blessing came with an expiry date, hence needing Lupa's body. So, with Arsenos' blessing and its own sentinel frequencies, on the 3rd day of the Great Aegon story, Leviathan Mya is finally able to access the central hub, corrupted, and trigger the Dark Tide in Septimont. And that concludes Route 1 of the playbook, a repeating 3-day story of Lupa's road to championship before ultimately dying on the 3rd as Septimont drowns in a sea of black. So in some sense, yes, girl is suffering from success, but you know who's successful in the suffering? Leviathan Mya. Because being a Thenodian presence, it gets stronger by feeding off of humanity's collapsed will. And there's plenty of that when everyone's dead. So yeah, Cristoforo really gave Leviathan an infinite XP farm, which aligns with his whole vision of the Sonoro sphere simply being an amplifier designed to nurture the Thenodian's lingering power. Cool. Now ideally, the cycle will keep continuing until Leviathan Mya got big enough for Cristoforo to eventually overlay the Sonoro onto reality. But you know how I called this particular story Route 1? Well,
here comes a new challenger!
with the Thenodian's growing presence in Septimont, Cartethyia eventually picks up on its fishy scent. Thus, she makes her way over, off-rip, because empathy. She's already been through Leviathan's shit, so she's not going to let hundreds of others go through it either. In slipping through the smallest of butt cracks of the Sonoro sphere, she finds Septimont already destroyed by the Dark Tide. Thus, she most likely arrived at the 3rd day of the story, where everything's gone to shit. It's interesting how even with the tiniest of cracks in the Sonoro sphere, Cartethyia was still able to pick up on the Thenodian's presence. I'm betting Leviathan's the fish you find inside a surströmming.
Disgusting!
When Cartethyia finds Lupa, she's not only an amnesiac, but also completely exhausted. These are symptoms of her not only losing her role, but constantly trying to escape Septimont. Now usually, Lupa would have died on the 3rd day of the Great Aegon, but alas, she does not thanks to Cartethyia's help. Thus, with this change in fate, the Sonoro sphere births a new story. A story of Cartethyia and Lupa making their way across the dilapidated Septimont to find the source of all this destruction. Because yes, 2 heads are indeed better than 1, unless one of them's mine. Unfortunately, on the 3rd day of this new story, Lupa succumbs to the Dark Tide's corruption and passes away, but not before Cartethyia marks her with her frequency. Yes, throughout their journey, Cartethyia has been leaving breadcrumbs for our Lord Arbiter, in the hopes that he'll come for her eventually. Nevertheless, Cartethyia must now continue her journey alone, and she's actually pretty successful. She tracks down Leviathan Mya and then Leviathan Mya phones a bigger friend, but too bad Cartethyia is a big girl too, so... And then finally, Cartethyia tracks down Cristoforo. Remember when Cristoforo is humbly mentioning to Cartethyia that he can't take all the credit for the tragedy in Septimont? Dude's legit right though, because freaking Julia over here got his help after having her hand forced by other Septimontians. So in some sense, yes, the Septimontians do have blood on their hands, and Cristoforo is about to get blood in his face because he's about to take a fight, gets a Gotencho point blank. All that action in one day, mind you. God damn. And then, yeah, Cartethia's route isn't over, but I think it's time we go to Rover's POV, because whilst Lupa's back on day 1, their chance meeting will allude to a once again not so normal story.
Here comes a new challenger!
In failing to find Cartethyia at the Avinoleum, Rover does pick up on the trail she left behind, which points us to Septimont. Cantarell also advises how Septimont is currently hosting the Great Aegon. Thus, this fact implies that when Lupa did enter Cristoforo's Sonorosphere, it was before the Great Aegon was actually meant to take place. And it's also this piece of information that I swear the devs purposely put in order to really fuck with us lore people. Anyhow, in following the frequency, Rover too finds himself inside the Sonorosphere, considering how Abby suddenly disappears from him. Now you might be wondering, how did Rover even get in? Because Cartethyia had to get in via a pretty small window, right? You can't just randomly stumble into it. Yes, small window for small girl, but no. I suspect in Rover following the breadcrumbs, it unknowingly led him through that small Sonoro hole too. So, Rover finds himself in day 1 of the story. Now, usually on this day 1, Lupa confirms her teammates to be cheating, flames them, then proceeds to solo the Great Aegon. But in meeting Rover, she actually partners up with him, and with this change of fate, a new story in the Sonoro is born. Their story plays out quite similarly to the original, but with extra love, literally, because Lupa's not alone anymore. Yes, she still glitches in and out of Leviathan Mya, but hey, she's got the fellow warrior at least. Furthermore, in the story, she's actually able to cancel Julius Silver and her house for all their cheating, something she failed to do in the original story. Although, just as the second night is about to end, Rover experiences a rather fascinating dream with Filova, whereby she kind of spills the beans on everything that's about to happen in Septimont, albeit very out of context. Bruh, if I ever dreamed about Filova... Anyway, on the 3rd day of the Great Aegon, the finals, something a little interesting happens. As Rover fights in the final, he experiences an overlap. Now all he sees in the battleground is the bloody Aegon from 20 years ago. It's called an overlap because whilst yes he is still fighting opponents in the finals, this scene is overlapped by the bloody Aegon of the past. And in this overlap, he can also feel Cartethyia nearby as the two fight their own day 3 battles respectively. Nevertheless, the two are still in their separate stories. But back to Rover, battle royale or not, you're not winning if it's against the Lord Arbiter himself. And thus, Lupa and Rover get the dub. And in doing so, of course, Arsenarosa blesses the two. And then the story proceeds as you'd expect. We got Rover attached. Sure, they encounter a little hiccup with overlaps again, but they still make it to the Veil of Glory. And then, you know...
Here's Johnny!
But it's here where the story takes a turn. Leviathan Mya might have corrupted the hub, but Rover's here to purify the wicked. O ye of little faith, I banish you!
You have been forgiven.
And so Rover successfully splits Lupa from Leviathan Mya using his Imperator powers. And then he opens a gateway for Lupa to enter into a new story. Gotta say, if not for Rover, none of this would be happening. Totally could see her being a temporary ally in 2.5. And now we've got 2 stories whose endings are on hold. In Cartethia's story, she's making her way over to Cristoforo. And in Rover's story, he's holding the line against Leviathan. So, what will Lupa do in her new story? Well, first off, she's got to readjust after being blasted with every single memory she's ever had since entering the Sonorosphere, a side effect of being separated from the Thenodian, but I'll dive into that later. And now, she's got to go spear fishing, literally. Equipped with her memories on prior cycles, she immediately heads for the aqueducts to find Leviathan Mya, which she eventually does. The two duke it out in an epic duel, and Lupa emerges victorious. In Rover's story, Rover too emerges victorious against Leviathan. And finally, in Cartethia's story, she manages to track down Cristoforo again and nearly bisects him along with Scar. But alas, this time Cristoforo learned better than to do things raw like he did when he impregnated Griffin Fortress. So he brought protection this time, or was that Scar's doing? Speaking of Scar, that dude was so keen to scrap with Cartethyia, but alas, we'll have to see that another day, hopefully. Well, whatever the case, Cartethyia is successful in stripping Cristoforo's ability to control the Sonorosphere, and thus, the Sonoro collapses. The trio reunite in reality, and well, yeah, that sums up the major events of Wuthering Waves 2.4. Wonderful. But in that brain-rotted toilet bowl of a recap, I suspect you still have many questions, in terms of like, the actual answers for many of the mysteries we encountered in this patch. So, let's start tackling them. First up, once again, what really happened at the Avinoleum? I'm bringing this up again because I swear nowhere in the story did they mention what happened. And considering the state it was in when Rover found it, I just could not ignore it. Quoting Abby here, this place looks like it was just bombarded. So what happened? I suspect when Cartethyia caught whiff of Leviathan during her stay at the Avinoleum, it probably triggered some kind of PTSD moment, and we probably saw the manifestation of it in a Resonator showcase. Yes, I believe when Cartethyia was fighting Imperator here, that was just her trauma going a little haywire, an intense mental battle with a past abuser, thus leading to the crime scene of Resonance energy discharge left at the Avinoleum. Furthermore, right after this showcase, Cartethyia is in Septimont, and this aligns with the fact that that upon sensing Leviathan, Cartethyia immediately dips to the region. Thus, the crazy frequencies left at the Avinoleum was due to a PTSD episode by Cartethyia. Now, as to why I believe the Thenodian's return had such a profound effect on her, considering half her being was made by the Thenodian, that's 50% of her that's feeling the pull. Leviathan's trying to get back together. And this is what I call non-consensual Stockholm Syndrome. Cartethyia doesn't want to come back, but her body says otherwise. Yuck. But do you know what else is kind of yuck? Cristoforo. But hey, that's why a lot of people, myself included, love him. So for our next mystery to discuss, let's talk about his Forte again. As we know, to probably realize his 3-day fiction of her protagonist winning the Great Aegon, Cristoforo created a Sonorosphere that completely enveloped all of Septimont, and the story would just continuously loop, which for Cristoforo's use case meant he could continuously feed Leviathan. Now, does that mean his Sonorosphere can only house one story? No. To quote Lupa, this Sonoro is like a book of plays. So how does one create new stories in the Sonoro then? I believe it's by the main protagonist's fate changing. In the original story, Lupa wins the Great Aegon alone, and then dies by the 3rd day. But when Cartethyia saved her, thus preventing her death on the 3rd day, a new story was formed. And then later, when Rover teams up with her, thus preventing her from taking on the Great Aegon alone, a new story was formed. And then finally, with Lupa being free of Leviathan Mya, thus preventing her from losing her role, a new story was formed. Further evidence of this fate change being the reason for new story formations can be seen when Lupa concludes how, before Cartethyia came to Septimont, she had wandered the same bloody story more times than she can count, as if to imply it's only in meeting Cartethyia does she enter a new story. But regardless of how many new stories are formed, it's all timed to be 3 days. This is evident in Cartethyia's story, whereby on her 3rd day, she notices the buildings, statues, and even the land itself were cracking like damn paper. There doesn't need to be a special event on the 3rd day in order for the story to end. If it's been 3 days, the story will end. Extra last cheeky little thing before I move on. I suspect another reason as to why Cartethyia calls her Septimont an anomaly is because normally the story is only meant to be during the Great Aegon, and yet in her one, it's just an extended stay at Septimont gone wrong. Hence anomaly. Anyway, so with there being multiple stories inside of Cristoforo's Sonorosphere, how do they all exist together? Well, I believe they exist in parallel to each other, but according to narrative chronology, not actual timeline chronology. That's a lot of big words, Tomotoki. What the f do you mean by that, you pompous prick? Well, when Rover arrives in Septimont, he's still able to see Cartethyia's leftover frequencies, which of course should be the case since she did arrive earlier than him. And yet, when Rover's fighting in the bloody Aegon, Cartethyia in parallel is fighting Arsinosa, which also should make sense considering this is something that's happening on the 3rd day of both their stories. But of course, from a timeline chronology perspective, that shouldn't be the case because Cartethyia's battle must have happened earlier than Rover's considering she arrived earlier than him. Thus, I repeat, the stories exist parallel to each other, but according to narrative chronology, not actual timeline chronology. In the Sonoro, if it's day 1 in Rover's story, then it's day 1 in Cartethyia's story, regardless if Cartethyia ended up in her day 1 earlier than Rover did. Cool. So that sums up the story parts of Cristoforo's ability, and honestly, this line by Lupa pretty much summarizes that all too. New pages keep appearing, layering over the old, and the changes in one story bleed through to the next. The new pages are the new stories, and when they layer over the old, it indicates that they exist in parallel with the other. And then with Cartethyia entering into the first story and saving Lupa on day 3, those were the changes that thus bleed into the next new story. Ta-da! But whilst the stories do exist in parallel, is that all they do? Things that exist in the same space. Surely there's gotta be bits and pieces that overlap, right? Well, along with being able to hold multiple stories, the Sonorosphere is also capable of overlapping those stories too, literally. And it makes sense. With things that exist in the same space, there's bound to be some overlapping. When I say overlaps, by the way, I mean that some elements from one story will manifest in another, and vice versa. This is seen most clearly when Rover's in the Vale of Glory, and then suddenly the area is overlapped by a version of it that's inhabited with Tacit Discords and Tidal Blight. To quote Rover's observation, every time there's an overlap like this, the Tidal Blight appears as well as Tacit Discords. Thus, I'm pretty damn sure that the Dark Tide elements that are manifesting in this story are from Cartethyia's story, the Dark Tide ruined Septimont. But then there's also another notable overlap that happens when Rover is suddenly transported to the bloody Aegon during this finals fight, which is odd. An overlap with the past? I thought overlap should only be happening between stories currently happening. I mean, this isn't an isolated incident too, because in Cartethyia's story, she finds records that appear to have been rewound nearly 2 decades back. So what's going on? Because the only thing that belongs to 20 years ago is Mya's story, and that's not really a story, that's just reference material, right? Well, I actually suspect that since Leviathan Mya is still the Mya from 20 years ago, who is currently active within the Sonorosphere, I believe that enables her past to also be manifested as a story too. Furthermore, I believe Cristoforo had to frame Mya's time in the Great Aegon 20 years ago as a story in order to reference it as a story. He defined Mya as being its protagonist, and then he defined her victories at the 3-day Aegon as being its narrative. Thus, the overlaps with events from 20 years ago being possible. Yeah, I'm not sure if I explained that properly. Whoops. But hopefully I explain things better in this next section, because it's time we talk about the nitty-gritties within each story. I'm talking roles. For any story he wants to tell, Cristoforo must adhere to their reference material, or as he calls it, the fictitious anchor. And I suspect in fulfilling this anchor, this enables him to do the role swapping in his stories. Now you get my JJK reference. Though I swear it's more like role replacing, because one person gets a new identity and the other becomes a vegetable of sorts. I'll expand on this a little later. So, with his story being anchored by contender Mya's victories during the Great Aegon of 20 years ago, he must ensure that whichever protagonist he selects must adhere to that core story element too, the winning of the Great Aegon. Hence Lupa being selected to be his lead. She's someone that's legitimately capable of winning the Great Aegon. Now, Cristoforo can, as the name states, swap two characters, and the one who is swapped out essentially gets their role stolen, which is evident as they lose their memory and their name. So, when Leviathan Mya is fully swapped out with Lupa, she essentially became Lupa. She's got Arsenos' blessing and was even able to adopt her appearance. But with Lupa, well, she didn't get nothing. She didn't inherit any of Mya's memories, nor her identity. Nada. Hence why I say vegetable. Or maybe there's nothing to inherit, because technically Mya's dead. Wait, is that why Lupa's always dying? Because she's swapping identities with a dead woman? Anyway, before I throw out my entire video from another last minute revelation, I gotta ask, can Cristoforo just swap out anyone he wants? I'm thinking no. In order for the swap to even happen, I theorize the characters must share the same core roles in the stories, as well as yield the same outcomes in it. Mya is the protagonist of the story referenced, while Lupa is the protagonist of the story itself, and both characters won the Great Aegon. It's the literal fictitious anchor. Thus, Cristoforo can perform the role swap, since the story's end won't change. The Great Aegon is still won, no matter who assumes the main protagonist's role between the two. This is probably why he has to ensure his story sticks to the framework, because if it doesn't, then this role swap probably won't be possible. But wait, with that thinking to explain the swap, shouldn't that mean only past Mya and current Lupa can swap? How is it that Leviathan Mya is able to replace Lupa? Well, like the overlaps with the past happening, at the end of the day, Leviathan is still in the body of that same Mya from the past. The same Mya that's the main protagonist of the story referenced. Yes, the story and the character are from 20 years ago, but that same character is still present right now. It's just that Leviathan is currently inhabiting her. I mean, even Lupa exacerbates this notion, mentioning that Leviathan tried to use Mya to steal her role. Furthermore, when Cristoforo was able to fish out the dead Mya, it was only after seeing her body does he come up with the plan, which indicates he can't just randomly bring characters from the past back to reality. He had Mya's flesh in his hands, and thus knew that he could use her experiences from 20 years ago to essentially reanimate this corpse. And finally, we know that this is Leviathan Mya taking over Lupa's role because every time the glitch happens, we see the form of Mya that's been completely taken over by Leviathan, not normal Mya. Okay, but if it really is Leviathan Mya, then shouldn't we be seeing his giant sashimi form then? Also no, because we've seen her being able to change her form at will. If it's espionage, she'll go bipedal. If it's a fight, she'll bisect you. Right, so if the role swap happens, Lupa will lose her identity and memories. But if it's thwarted, Lupa remembers everything again? Everything? Even things from previous stories? How? Well, to tie the role swap to memories some more, Lupa mentions how since Rover stopped the Thenodian in the last story, and this time, she hasn't lost her memory. But there's a part of me that just can't accept that statement at face value. I need more logic to that answer. So I think I managed to come up with my own. Ha! What makes Lupa special is that she is the central figure that's consciously present in every story change. After all, it's the change in her fate that causes the story to change. But regardless of the story, assuming her role hasn't been stolen yet, Leviathan Mya will always be there to take her memories. Take them. A role swap involves one person taking another person's identity. Leviathan Mya is not disposing of Lupa's memories, she's just taking them. She takes all the memories, no matter how much has accumulated over the cycles. And thus, in Rover explicitly removing Leviathan Mya from Lupa, he has stopped the role swapping process entirely. Therefore, Lupa is now able to remember everything, because there's no longer a constant Thenodian presence that's taking her identity. Great, so that explains that. But then there's just one more little mystery I want to solve. It's literally in this one line that Lupa mentions, I only regained my name after I met the warrior, i.e. she only got her role back after meeting Rover. So what, prior to meeting Rover, she was still role-less? How? Because when she met Rover, it was day 1, and yet as we've commonly known, Lupa should have lost her role by day 3, right? Here's my theory to answer that. So, in the original story, Lupa eventually loses her role, and then on the 3rd day, she fully does, which is the state that Cartethyia finds her in. Regardless if the two make a new story, the story still starts with Lupa being role-less, and then, in Lupa passing, she's actually forced back to the original plot, because Cartethyia kept her story from finishing. After all, you can't repeat a story that hasn't finished yet. And then, whilst traversing the 1st day for a bit without a role, she meets Rover, and then a new story forms, and then she regains her role. Because in this new story, it starts at day 1, the beginning. And at the beginning, Lupa should always still have her role, thus her gaining it back after meeting Rover. I mean, when Lupa's recounting her journey with Rover, she comments how Leviathan was using Mya to steal her role again. It successfully did it in the 1st story, Lupa lived with it in the 2nd story, and now Lupa could lose it in the 3rd story. Or I could be completely wrong about all that. Honestly, why do I dive head deep for minute crumbs of lore details? But alright, okay, I think that finally puts the nail into the ins and outs of Cristoforo's ability, in full. Crazy how I'm certain there's more to his ability that we have yet to see, but I'll piece that together once it comes. Let's finally move on from Cristoforo and talk about another mystery in Wuthering Waves 2.4. Why were the echoes unstable? When inspecting the 6-inch widescreen LED feline echo, Rover notices how unstable its frequency is, and as he travels across Septimont, this same notion is seen for all echoes here. But what is happening to all of them? Well, you know in the overlap section, I was yapping about how we often see elements of one story overlap into another? Well, in Cartethyia Septimont, I'm pretty sure the friendly Septimontine echoes don't exist. They're gone, like everyone else. And with this being something that's overlapping in Rover's story, this is probably why their frequencies are unstable. They're both existing and not. But then, how do I know that they don't exist in Cartethia's story? Well, before I dive into that, let's first establish the central hub's connection to the Genesis Nexus beacons found throughout Septimont. The too long don't read, I'm pretty sure the hub powers those beacons, and the beacon's primary function, I quote, echoes can manifest independently for a prolonged time without terminals. So with this in mind, let's go back to the story. With the central hub's corruption, it's also depowered since it's clearly been critically damaged, as you can see when the rings stop moving autonomously. Thus, I'm pretty sure that depowers the Genesis Nexus beacons found across Septimont too, and henceforth, the friendly echoes which manifest around these will no longer appear. And with Cartethia's story being set after the central hub's corruption, it makes sense as to why there's no friendly echoes existing. And as this element of her story overlaps with Rover's, it leads him to seeing all those unstable echoes. Ta-da! But outside echoes, there's also the Septimontian people who were caught in the Sonoro sphere. So what the hell was their experience like in the Sonoro? To clarify, yes, anyone who happened to be in Septimont during Cristoforo's overlay of his story would have been caught in the Sonoro sphere. Our evidence is seen with Wuthering, because in her after-story quest, Rover questions whether she realized she was in the Sonoro at the start. So, does the general populace remember everything that happened in each cycle? Do they lose their memories too? How do they feel about each cycle? Honestly, to the average person, this all most likely just felt like a really weird dream. A dream featuring only the first story, by the way, since those other stories were created by Lupa's fate being changed, but everyone else was just being everyone else. Anyhow, why do I believe it was like a dream? Well, according to Wuthering's response, she replies that for a Taoist like her, it felt like some kind of out-of-body thing, and the phenomena associated with out-of-body experiences are dreams. So, when all the Septimontians drown in the dark tide and then the story resets back to day one, they probably think to themselves,
that's crazy, man.
But as for Lupa's situation, I would say she experiences all that too, but with an extra touch of identity crisis thanks to the role swap. The difference is indeed subtle, but I think everyone suffers the same. Oof. Speaking of people that did suffer, by far the worst sufferer of all this is Mya. But thankfully, in that last fight, she did make a final better appearance. But how did this happen? I mean, 90% sure normal Mya appearing was probably just a dev team abiding by the rule of cool, i.e. making her appear to make the scene feel more sentimental and cool. But then there's that 10% of me who thinks, yeah, there's legit some skin in the lore which can explain why Mya actually appeared. So let's talk about it. For starters, albeit being dead for the last 2 decades, Mya's reverberations continue to exist in Leviathan Mya. We know this because Lupa literally outlines it. The last trace of Mya's reverberation was forced to be part of it, tortured and ravaged. Her reverberations trapped in that monstrous body. I can't imagine her suffering over the last 20 years. And whilst the majority of the time it was Leviathan that had control, I suspect in that final battle, where it was framed as a genuine honorable duel between one respectful gladiator and another, I'm pretty confident that Mya's reverberation seized back control, because this is her thing. This is what she loves. And in those 2 decades of suffering, she finally gets to do that thing. And ain't no way she gonna let some stupid ass godfish take that chance away from her. Thus, for that final fight, Mya's reverberations took back control, and our brave gladiator fought to her last, with dignity. Ah, go Mya. What a last stand. And speaking of last stands, what did Lupa mean when she mentioned how Rover and Cartethyia stayed on their stories' last pages to give new stories a fighting chance? This will be a quick section, but since it wasn't completely clear to me off rip, I thought to make it a section anyway. So, what was the benefit of Cartethyia and Rover staying on their story's ending to ensure it doesn't end? Well, in Cartethyia sticking to her story, I suspect this is how she's able to maintain the frequency trail she left for Rover. Because if her story ended, then I heavily suspect that trail would disappear too, as the story would restart. Thus, Rover and Lupa would have never found each other. As for Rover staying behind to make sure his story stays open, well, it's in his story that he created a Lupa without Leviathan Mya replacing her. So if his story ended, then Lupa will once again be bound to Leviathan Mya's takeover. Hence the whole thing about Cartethyia and Rover staying behind to give new stories a fighting chance. But you know who doesn't have a fighting chance? Leviathan Mya, because she's dead. Or is she? Now, as we've seen inside the Sonoro sphere, I'm pretty sure a legit death isn't a thing. Regardless if everyone dies in the story, by its end, everything just resets. Lupa too had died constantly, but nevertheless, her soul prevails in the Sonoro sphere. And I suspect even outsiders like Rover and Cartethyia who enter the Sonoro will experience the same rules too. So by that logic, is Leviathan Mya truly dead? I'd say, like with everyone else, probably not. But, and big but, I theorize the Fraxidus no longer have a need for Leviathan to be inhabiting Mya anymore. Because for starters, Lupa kicked its butt, so clearly the half-human, half-Avinoleum form ain't the way to go. It'll just keep getting its ass handed to it in every cycle. So what do? Well, I suspect Rover may have transferred Leviathan into that gem in the hopes that it could be used for a better plan, thus leaving Mya's corpse to return to being a corpse. Or maybe Leviathan was never inside Mya since its resurrection. Maybe it's been inside this gem since the whole time in the Sonoro sphere, thus making the gem be some kind of conduit that can enable a Avinoleum frequency inside a human, thus leading to that monstrous form. But if there's one thing I know for sure, is that I'm done. Time to look away from the present and think beyond. What could be happening from 2.4 onwards? Let's first discuss what the hell could we be expecting in 2.5. For starters, I need to hear Septimon's opinion in terms of everything that's transpired, because just recently, their entire city was stuck in a genjutsu. Surely Augusta and Yuno will have great thoughts on this matter, since they are Septimon's leaders, and yet, their city fell for Cristoforo's spell right under their noses. And technically, the Rover hasn't probably met them in real life yet, so I want to see that interaction too. But outside the Septimontians, in 2.5, we will be messing with Rover. Since she's the upcoming resonator for this patch, and yes, I'll be pulling because I got a hard on for the Fraxidus, I suspect the story for this patch might be more styled as an interlude of sorts, like Chacona's companion quest. How I see things playing out is that perhaps Rover and Rover will be thrust into a situation which forces them to become temporary allies and thus have to begrudgingly work together to see themselves out of their situation. And then by the story's end, Scar and Cristoforo will be coming to pick up their co-worker. Because that cutscene we saw for Rover in the Summer Games Fest trailer, yeah, that didn't appear anywhere in 2.4. We're going to be seeing that in 2.5. And since Scar's teleportation is seen with Cristoforo, maybe Scar 2 will also appear alongside him? Come on, Kuro Games, surely you're not going to regulate Scar into being an Uber. Now that I look at that cutscene again, maybe Rover will learn what the gem truly is, and thus he'll try and take it from Rover. But ultimately, he will be stopped by Cristoforo and Scar. In any case, main point is, I predict 2.5 will be a bit of an interlude. But hey, it means more screen time for the Fraxidus, and who doesn't love them? But there's also a part of me that's hoping we get some deeper Fraxidus knowledge in that patch. Come on, Kuro Games, I beg. Now then, what about beyond 2.5? I'm guessing after 2.5, we're gonna get political. Now hold your horses before you vomit in your mouths at the prospect of what I just said. I mean political as in, our cast of characters are going to get dragged into the power struggle of Septimon's Senates versus Augusta and Yuno. Because, if you recall, the whole reason Julius Silva helped out Cristoforo was so that he could aid in Julia's schemes to ensure her household stays on top in Septimont. And I have a feeling we have yet to see the outcomes of Cristoforo's ploys. Furthermore, in the first act of 2.4, Carto mentions, when referencing Augusta, if there's a storm brewing in Septimont, he intends to find the right place to take shelter. And I suspect that storm is the political war that's about to happen. But once again, very possible this is just some background stuff that Rover will never see. And finally, what can I guarantee with Septimon's future? Leviathan will return. Because if you look at the gem section in the script, we find out that the stone actually has some lore. It wasn't just some random jewelry on Mya's helmet, it's something special, originally from Raguna, passed between many hands, and now its natural cerulean hue has been tainted a deep purple and bears the mark of tidal blight. Deep within the crystal's depths, the silhouettes of fish drift slowly. Quite alarming how silhouette is plural here, as if the gem perhaps houses a school of Leviathan babies. Perhaps in the past, Leviathan thought it cannot spread its lovely whispers alone. It needed more of itself to spread its doctrine to other nations, and perhaps this is that method. Oh well, whatever happens, all we can do is wait and see. Now I best see to this video's conclusion. Well, hopefully you guys were able to min-max your understanding of Wuthering Waves 2.4, but I'm also hoping this video hasn't ended up confusing you even more. Yeah, I'm a guy that sometimes just makes a storm out of a teacup. Sometimes it's really not that deep, but I'm just like, nah, go balls deep. But you know what shouldn't chill? The passion of you viewers. Because if you made it up to here, oh yeah, you like some lore. So bash that keyboard and let me know your thoughts and theories about Wuwa 2.4 in the comments. Follow my socials if you want to keep up with your boy, and like and subscribe if you want more from your boy. Much love and take care. Here's what I usually say, but I'm actually going to end this video a little differently. I'm going to end it on a really hot take. Is it me? Or I swear Cartethyia would have solved the entire problem in Septimont by herself, without Lupa and Rover. Because ultimately, to stop the Sonoro sphere, you have to stop Cristoforo, which is what Cartethyia would have done eventually, without Rover or Lupa. I mean, yeah, Lupa might have given Cartethyia some context, but I truly suspect she still would have been able to track down Cristoforo by herself. So what was Lupa and Rover's role in solving the story's issue? Or maybe I'm reading the significance of this patch wrong. Perhaps it was all about Lupa and Mya's arc, and the ploy in Septimont was all just supplementing their development. Maybe this is all a brain fart from too much analysis. Okay, I'll just stop talking.